So with that, the real reason we're here is to hear McCaughan speak. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about Mac and then let him take the stage. So Mac is a co-founder of the Durham, NC independent record label Merge Records and the band Superchunk. Since its founding in 1989, Merge Records, Merge Records has put out well over 400 releases by a wide range of artists, including Spoon, She and Him, Neutral Milk Hotel, The Magnetic Fields, M. Ward, and Arcade Fire. Several of the label's albums have received awards, including Caribou Swim, which just won a Juno Award in 2011, and Arcade Fire's The Suburbs, which won 4 Juno Awards and the Grammy for Album of the Year in 2011. Mac also performs and releases records both with Superchunk and the solo project Portastic, and performs songs from both bands at his solo appearances. Combined, the two acts have released over 20 full-length albums and dozens of singles and EPs. Superchunk's next single, Void Faith, will be released on Merge in April. Mac co-authored the book Our Noise, The Story of Merge Records. He also serves on the board of both the Auckland and Nasher Museum of Art. So with that, McCaughan.
Thanks. Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Frank, for asking me to do this. When Frank first asked, I'm pretty sure I said no, because I don't especially enjoy public speaking, and I didn't have a talk. Like some people just have a talk, they go around, they do their talk. I don't really have that. But I'm glad that. I said I didn't have a talk, and then I think Matt said, well, that's even better if you don't have a talk. So I didn't have that excuse anymore. But I almost said no again when I found out that the theme for April is the future, because I don't like talking about the future. I certainly don't like predicting the future. You may recognize this as the cover for God Save the Queen. I think the initial title for that song was No Future, actually. I feel like, and I'll get into this a little bit later, I feel like one reason that we still exist as a record label and a band is because we haven't really spent a lot of time thinking about the future. I know that sounds strange, but I think it's the truth. So I grew up listening to classic rock, and my parents didn't have a lot of records, but the records that my dad did have, we listened to a lot in the house, and it was bands like the Rolling Stones and the Who, and my parents took us to see The Kids Are All Right, the film, when it was in the theater. We were on vacation, family vacation in Boston, and went to see the movie in the theater, and went back to the hotel room and jumped on the bed pretending to be the Who, and in some ways I think I'm still pretending that I'm in the Who. So that was a big influence on me, and I think that having music around all the time and seeing my parents' enthusiasm for it made me a fan of music, and I think that that's really informed everything that we do as a label and as a band, is that we approach it from the viewpoint of being fans of what other people have done or are doing. Judging from the names of the albums that I see on everyone's first albums that everyone bought, the first record you buy or your first exposure to music doesn't have to be a good record, apparently, for you to still. I mean, the first record I bought was the Grease soundtrack, so it doesn't necessarily determine your future in relationship with music, but I think that the fact that so many people can remember the first record they bought is a good thing. So grew up listening to classic rock, and I think in 1980 my favorite band was probably AC/DC. And then we moved to North Carolina, and North Carolina in the early 80s was a great place to be if you were into punk rock or any kind of alternative music, really. This is a Corrosion of Conformity band from Raleigh. That's another band from Raleigh, No Labels. Some of you may know former mayoral candidate Wayne Taylor on vocals there. And this is a band from Chapel Hill called A Number of Things. A lot of the conditions that made this area great for music then still exist. I think I found out about these bands from listening to college radio stations in the area, WXYC and WXDU. And KNC at the time I think was mainly a metal station. I'm not sure, it was hard to pick up in Chapel Hill and Durham, but you would hear these bands on the radio that you'd never heard before. They would be playing at the brewery or the Cat's Cradle, or sometimes doing an all-ages show somewhere, like the basement of a church in Durham or something. And I think A Number of Things and the band called Ugly Americans were the first hardcore bands I saw at the Duke Coffee House. And, it's one thing to be a fan of someone like, The Who, and I enjoyed seeing Van Halen at the Greensboro Coliseum, but you don't really feel like you're part of the thing that's happening. You're much more a spectator in that sense. But going to punk rock shows made you feel like you were part of the thing, and it also made you feel like you could have a band like that too, because it wasn't rocket science what was happening on stage. It was very exciting, but it seemed like anyone could do it. So I was in bands in high school, and you could easily start a band around here, practice in your garage or wherever, and then hopefully get to open for a band that was coming through playing at the Cradle, or open for, one of our most exciting gigs as a high school band was opening for the Connells at the brewery. So there was a lot going on that made it a fun thing to be a part of. In 1985, I went to school in New York. I went to college in New York, and that kind of just broadened my interest that I already had in buying records and going to see bands, because obviously you could do that even more easily up there. And the labels that the records were on became important things to know about. In other words, you wouldn't just follow a band, you would follow the label that the band was on, whether it was an American label like Discord, or an English label like 4AD or something, or Factory. If you knew that you liked this one band, you would look for the other bands on that label. And a lot of it had a very handmade feel, the records that were coming out at that time. You felt like the people, whether it was true or not, you felt like the people at the label were involved in every aspect of the music and the art, and the bands were working with the labels to make these things that were kind of special artifacts. And so in 1987, on a year I took off from school and was living back down here, along with a bunch of people from Raleigh, Wayne Taylor, Bill and Barbara, who run Tanis Root and Kung Fu here in Raleigh today, and 5 bands. We put together a box set of singles called Evil I Do Not, To Not I Live. And there's one single by each band. Barefoot Press printed the booklets. Barefoot Press was in a house, I think at the time, over on maybe, I can't remember, what was the corner of the street that Barefoot was on, where Bill and Barbara lived across the street? Boylan, yeah, that's right. So it was a real group effort, and we sold, I think we made 1,000 and sold 1,000 of these box sets, mainly locally. We had shows where all the bands played, and it not only did it introduce me to how you can make a record and how it's not that hard to get a record made, but I feel like the local media, for whatever that is, at the time it was largely The Spectator and then The Independent, local media started paying attention to local bands. I mean, certainly you would play a lot of shows where it was mainly your friends that were coming to see you, which was fine. But when we had the shows to release this box set, the shows sold out. We sold out the box set, and it felt like, wow, other people are paying attention to what's happening, not just all your friends who are also in bands. And so that was an important thing for me to learn, I think. couple years later, we and this music, by the way, the bands on this box set were Black Girls, Wax, and Slush Puppies, bands that I was in, a band called Egg, and a band called the Angels of Epistemology. Claire from the Angels of Epistemology is here today. It's weird music. It's not, this is not nothing you would hear on the radio except for the college radio. So, people were paying attention to and enjoying stuff that was pretty weird. A couple years later, we started Merge as a way to put out. I started with my partner Laura Balance, who's still my partner at Merge and is still in Superchunk. But we started the label as a way to put out bands that we were in and bands that our friends were in. And the first release we did was a cassette that we dubbed at home on a dubbing deck, like, 100 copies or something like that. Barefoot Press did the sleeves as they did all our early printing. And that's how we started. We started super small, doing tapes, doing 7 inches. Here's some of the first few releases that we did: Erectus Monotone, Angels, Wax, band from Richmond, Breadwinner, and the first Superchunk single when we were called Chunk. So the way we started was we'd put in some of our own money, and we would borrow money, usually from the band or from a friend who would loan us $500 or something to get the records made. We'd sell the records through local stores and distributors that distributed this kind of stuff nationally, and we did mail order. And then we would pay back whoever lent us the money, and then if there was any extra, we would just put it towards the next release. It was very much people sitting around in a living room, putting records together. The bands would help, and it felt like a real communal thing and not a job. I mean, it was more like an art project, I think, is kind of how it felt. We were making stuff. And it was exciting just to see the finished product, and even more exciting when someone would send you a letter, mail ordering a record because they saw your ad in Maximum Rock and Roll or something like that. Like I said, we were doing this, I feel like, more as fans. Like, what would I want to see if I was going into Peter Platters in Hoboken, or if I was going into School Kids in Chapel Hill? What would I want to see in the 7-inch bin that would make me want to buy that thing? And that's really how we were operating. Superchunk, that's Superchunk in 1990, I think. We had a lot more hair. Everyone had a lot more hair. A lot of hair happening. Superchunk, in some ways, became more well-known than Merge did faster. We signed a deal with Matador Records to put out our first couple albums because, again, Merge was just doing singles, and we couldn't really afford to press 1,000 LPs and 1,000 CDs and 1,000 cassettes, which you also were doing at the time. So we signed to Matador in New York to do our records, and we just started touring all the time. I mean, I think between 1990 and 2000, we probably were touring 3 to 6 months out of the year for that whole time period. And it was great while we were young. In 1992, Merge started doing full-length releases, and we were able to do this by entering into a partnership with Touch and Go Records. And Touch and Go is a label that had been around for a long time already at this point, and had put out records that we liked by bands like Big Black in the 80s. And so they kind of took on Merge as like they were a distributor, and they would have the goods manufactured, and we were still signing the bands and promoting the bands and that kind of thing. So the first couple records, full-length albums we put out were the first Paulvo album, which is this, Core Crane Secret, and a Superchunk singles compilation called Tossing Seeds. And, being able to do that, being able to put out full-length records really opened up who we could work with as a label. Other bands started hearing about Merge, and allowed us to work with bands that we were just fans of, and that when we first started, we never would have thought we could work with. Bands from as far away as New Zealand, a band called the 3Ds that we were huge fans of. From New Zealand, that was one of the first albums we did. Band called the Magnetic Fields. From Boston at the time, was a band, again, like I was working in School Kids and I had their single and I got in touch with them because I loved their 7-inch, and I think that we probably got in touch with them to see if they would play a show with us in Boston, to see if they would open for Superchunk. And I remember, I think the response was something like, we don't really do loud rock shows or something like that. I don't remember, but we started a relationship with the Magnetic Fields and we ended up putting out an album called Charm of the Highway Strip. And last year, maybe, I can't remember if it was last year or the year before, we put out the most recent Magnetic Fields record. And so we're still working with them, but as Superchunk grew and the label grew, we moved from office to office in Chapel Hill, and we would hire one employee at a time kind of thing. And by 1999, we maybe had 6 or 7 people working there, including Laura and myself, but I don't think that Laura and I were even paying ourselves yet at this point. I think that we were getting paid by Superchunk, because Superchunk was still touring and selling records. And through the 90s, Superchunk's records were the biggest selling records on Merge. But in 1999, we put out this Magnetic Fields box set called 69 Love Songs. Around that same time, we put out this Neutral Milk Hotel record called In the Aeroplane Over the Sea. And both these records would become bigger than anything that Superchunk had done and kind of establish Merge, I think, as something other than Superchunk's label, even though we had been something other than that for a long time. But these records, when I think about it now, again, I just come back to this thing of like, only fans of these bands would think it was a good idea to do a 3 CD box set of 69 songs about love by Stephen Merritt. And even then, I mean, we, talking about being able to see the future or not, I mean, even we were very skeptical about that, to the extent that we, when we did the 69 Love Songs box set, we said, okay, well, we'll make 2,000 copies of the box set, because only the hardcore fans are going to want this like 3 CD box set. And it's sold over 100,000 copies at this point, as well as all the individual albums, which we insisted on doing also, because we said no one's going to want to buy the box set. You have to release them separately too. So, we always operated in a pretty conservative way in terms of what we were doing, spending money-wise. We weren't giving bands big advances, and because I think we always kind of felt like, well, this could all fall apart at any time or something, So we're very careful, which I think really did serve us well and allowed us to survive years where we didn't have any records that sold a ton of copies. But again, every once in a while, something like 69 Love Songs or this Neutral Milk Hotel record would become these kind of left field. I mean, for us, they were big hits, I mean, for a major label, they wouldn't even register as a blip on what sales mean to them. But for us, any record that, a record selling over 100,000 copies was kind of unimaginable to us at the time. And so around 2000, 2001, Superchunk started to slow down. We were touring less, and we put out a couple records by a band called Spoon from Austin, Texas, that had been on a major label and been dropped by a major label. And we shared their booking agent was a mutual friend of ours, and said, like, Spoon they want to make another record. And he sent us some demos, and some other friends of ours who knew the band sent us demos, and you got to hear these new Spoon songs. And that record is called Girls Can Tell. It's a great record, and that record and the Spoon records that followed got bigger and bigger each time, bigger than I think the band expected, and certainly bigger than we expected. And it was good for us that around this time, Superchunk wasn't so active, and Laura and I could spend more time at the label, because records that sold, 50,000 copies, 100,000 copies started to become more, not the norm, but something that could happen, and that, required a lot more resources, a lot more hours, man hours. And so, Merge staff grew again, like maybe 2001 when we moved our offices to Durham, maybe we had 8 people working at Merge or something. And then in 2004, we put out the first album, which is called Funeral by the Arcade Fire, a band from Montreal. And the reason that we even knew about the Arcade Fire is because on our first tour, first Superchunk tour the first time we played in Montreal, we met a guy named Howard Billerman in 1990, 91 maybe. We were opening for Mudhoney. Howard would come to all our shows in Montreal after that. And we became friends with him. And in 2003, he sent me an email saying, I'm playing drums in this band. I think you might like it. It's not really my band. I just play drums, so if you don't like it, it's not a big deal. I'm going to send you some stuff. And I said, okay. And so, I was really dreading getting this package. And he sent a DVD that wouldn't play in any DVD player. And he said, like, Howard, just like send a normal CD or something that I can listen to, So he sent a CD and probably sat on my desk for a few weeks because I was thinking, like, I'm going to have to listen to this and tell Howard I don't like his band. And anyway, when I finally did listen to it, it was great, and it was the demos for Funeral. And we ended up, working with the Arcade Fire, and we're still working with the Arcade Fire. And again, it was one of those things that, as much as we enjoyed it, listening to it around the office, and we thought it was great, and we thought people are going to love this band, and they played a show at the Cave in Chapel Hill that was incredible, and we thought, wow, people are really going to love this band when they see them live. There was no way for us to know how big that record would be and how big that band would become. For better or worse, the downside of being conservative and not really knowing what is going to happen with something like this is that you don't make enough, the record runs out, stores don't have it, people try to buy it, they're complaining. The band insisted on a fancy package, so it takes a long time to make that package. So you can't get the CDs as fast as you want them, all this stuff, But at the same time, I think that, not gambling on the things that we were doing, but more trying to be realistic. It's better to be surprised in this way, I think, than to be surprised in the other way and have something not do nearly as well as you think it's going to. 7 years later, it's another picture of the Arcade Fire. 7 years later, the band won a Grammy for Album of the Year with their album, The Suburbs. And again, that's not something that, if someone said, like, what do you think is going to happen in 2011, if someone asked you that in 1989, you would never say, like, well, we'll probably have the #1 record in the country, it'll probably win a Grammy. Like I said, it's better to be surprised about things like that than to try to count on things like that happening. And so I'll quickly go back to why I don't like the future. Again, if 1989 someone said, they're going to figure out a way to compress music so much that it sounds terrible, and then everyone will get it for free. That would not have been like my idea of an awesome future. I think that we still would have done what we did and had the label and had the band and everything, but it's just one of those things that doesn't sound so great and is not so great in a lot of ways. I enjoy having a portable MP3 player. I like technology. I use it, but a lot of what we try to do, I think, is to push back against that a little bit in the sense that for us, this stuff that is still successful for our records is the most old-fashioned stuff. Touring, bands playing great shows, making great records, making packages that are beautiful, that people want to buy, and people ask, when you tell people you have a record label, they picture you having a pressing plant. I think that's what they picture, is like an office with machines making records, making CDs and stuff. That's a pressing plant that we use in Canada called RIP V. That's a record getting made up there, and it's about to have the edge trimmed off, and then it will be an LP. But we don't have that. Our office, this is the most interesting room in our office, is the basement. And that's a bunch of She and Him albums getting about ready to get shipped out. And that's really more like what a record label office looks like. But I think that our job on a broader scale, what we do as a record label is, or what I think we should be doing, is creating fans. Because I feel like that's who supports bands and labels and music, is people that feel like a connection and an investment in the thing that they love. you can get pretty much anything for free music-wise if you want to, you know. But that's, but to me, like a file, even if, you know, if I'm buying something on iTunes, it's a file, it's in my computer, I forget that I even have it, you know. And I feel like it's more valuable for us to create connections with people to this stuff so that they feel like, you know, I'm gonna, you know, they feel like a part of the process, and they feel like this band is doing something that's of value to me, and I'm gonna support that by buying their record, going to see them. You know, iTunes is a great model, and people buy music through iTunes, and bands get paid from that. But you know, I still feel a stronger connection to the physical side of things, and these are some recent releases on Merge. And as you can see, like, we still do everything on LP because vinyl sales are actually one of the places that music is growing over the last few years. It's not growing enough to replace all the people that are illegally downloading things, but it's growing, and I feel like that's a good sign for us. And you know, I think that people talk about how people used to buy so much more music, and they did. The 80s and 90s were a great time for the music industry as a whole. I mean, they invented a format that made everyone buy all the records they had all over again with CDs. So, you know, they can't have expected that to happen again. So in some ways, it's like now the opposite is happening. Someone created another technology where no one has to buy anything. But you know, I think that I was reading an article the other day about, you know, someone analyzing that idea that people bought more music in the 80s and 90s because of CDs, and that's why sales were so great then. But you know, there were just more smash records then. There were more records that sold, you know, 8 million, 10 million, 15 million copies than happens these days. And so I feel like, and what this article was saying, which I think I partially agree with, is that the reason that doesn't happen anymore is not so much because, oh, everyone has their CDs already and they're not buying music anymore. I think there's a real fracturing of mainstream culture to the extent that there's very few records that everyone just like unites around, you know, in this super top 40 kind of way, you know. I mean, I think Taylor Swift or Adele or someone like that is a current example of when that happens, but it doesn't happen that often. And so I think that in some ways that's okay with me, because I've never felt like we were part of the music industry, capitalized. I mean, I felt like labels like Merge and Matador and Sub Pop have always kind of, and obviously labels much smaller than us and bigger than us, operate more on the edges and find our audience. And as long as you create, I mean, you can call that a niche, but you can be a pretty big niche. And as long as it's big enough to support what we're doing, what the bands that we work with are doing, I think that that's all right. But I mean, it doesn't mean that there's not a lot of work to do to create those fans and to find those people and to let them know that you exist and that your records are out there. I mean, that's our job. But I still think that you know, again, like not thinking so much about the future and like what's going to happen and what, you know, what will the music industry look like, and more focusing on, well, what is the record that's right in front of you? Like, what is the band that you're working with need from you in the next 2 months or in the next 6 months? I think that's much more appealing to me, and I think it works for us, and I think it's more appealing to the people that are buying the records, because if you're a fan of music, what you're thinking about is not like, I wonder what my favorite band's gonna do in 10 years. You want to go get their new record. You want to get the record, the thing that they're doing right now. And so, you know, I think that running the label as fans and running Superchunk as fans making records because that's what we love doing is the way that we'll continue to operate. So, thanks. I meant to bring a copy of a book called Our Noise, which is a history of Merge Records, because it has a quote in it that I really like, that I wanted to read, and so I meant to read it earlier, but I'll go ahead and read it now. It's a quote from Jenny Toomey, who she had a label called Simple Machines and a band called Tsunami that started around the same time as we started Merge. She says, "There's a great line in a Destroyer song. Formative years wasted, in love with our peers, we tasted life with the stars. She says, I couldn't have found language that was more clear about the whole idea of what we were doing. The 20 people who understood what you were talking about are the 20 most important people in the world. Maybe that's the difference between professional culture and outsider culture. Our antennae were tuned very specifically for like minds, as opposed to sending out a signal to convert people. There are some kinds of art that are trying to find their peers, and there's other kinds that are trying to make peers. So I think that that's a good description of what we were doing then, and you know, on a larger scale, yes, but I think what we're still doing. So is there time for questions?
Yeah.
Okay.
So thanks so much, Mac. I think now we kind of open the floor for a few minutes as kind of more conversational Q&A. Did anyone want to take a first stab?
All right then. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
I want to know, Mac, did you mentally catalog all the shows that you guys played? You know what I mean? Like, did you store them as all run together? Like, if somebody said, we saw you in 1999 at the Green Room in Tempe, and would you be like, yeah, there's a pool table at the back, and, you know?
To a certain extent, it probably depends on if the show is really great or really terrible. For instance, like I remember playing in Tempe most times because it was really terrible. But no, I think that I'm not as I don't retain that as much as Jim and John in the band do. Like they remember details that I never remember. But yeah, to a certain extent, for sure.
I was just wondering if there was ever times or a time when you really questioned what you were doing and whether you should go forward, or you and your partners, met with some real, dry spell, or just a question of your vision.
I guess because I never really felt like there was a vision, I never really questioned the vision. You know what I mean? Yeah. It wasn't so laid out as that. And in terms of questioning it, yeah, I mean, there's definitely times again, it's more like if you start thinking like, well, what's going to happen, now that there's, 14 people working at Merge, what's going to happen next year if none of our records sell any copies? Or like, what do we, you can definitely go down that road, but I don't advise it. And so I try not to. But in terms of, but I'd say basically no. I mean, it's more just like I said, like we're just kind of doing what we're doing, and because we do it in a pretty, like I said, conservative way, we're never like putting ourselves out there too much in that sense, financially or resource-wise, to a point where, if this record doesn't happen, then we're done. Like that. We've never put ourselves in that position, luckily.
What do you guys think about streaming services like Spotify and Pandora and things like that? How does that work for labels and for your bands?
I mean, there's no answer to that in terms of how it works, because I don't think anyone knows. But it's easy to argue both sides, and certainly the argument that a streaming service makes is, look, we're getting people into the idea of paying for music. They're paying for Spotify or whatever instead of just downloading stuff for free. But the money that comes in from streaming services is so small, so incremental, and means so little to most bands that I think a band, and certainly there's a label called Temporary Residence in New York that there's a good interview online with Jeremy from Temporary Residence, if you search it, where he talks about this idea where he's going to do an experiment and not have any of their releases on streaming services for a year and see how it affects their income. Because I think that the percentage of revenue that's streaming versus downloads, we're just talking about digital music sales now, it's growing each year, and it's I think it may approach like 20% this year of digital revenue. But at the same time, if you didn't have anything on those services, would all those people really just be going to get that stuff for free, or would they just go buy it from iTunes and then the band would actually get paid? It's hard to say, and it's a tough call. And Wilson Fuller, who works at Merge and has the relationships with all our digital service providers, he thinks it's a good idea to have our stuff on there, and he will always argue for that. If the service is good, that, look, you know, there's people that wouldn't be paying for it otherwise. There's people that will listen to Spotify and then go buy the album. You know, so you know, I think that it's really hard to know now what the outcome is. I mean, again, like as an example of, well, maybe it's not so bad. You know, a band like Mumford & Sons, who sold 600,000 copies their first week that their record came out this year, they had that record on Spotify. So you can look at that and say, well, it didn't hurt them, but you could say, well, maybe they would have sold 650,000 copies if it wasn't on Spotify, and it would have made much more money for them. So I don't know. You know, it's hard to say. In the back?
Mac, percentage-wise, like on the Arcade Fire album, Suburbs, whatever, vinyl versus CD versus download, like how did that sell in each of those categories, just percentage-wise, whatever? Do you
I
have
think
any
that
idea?
Suburbs is at around 50, or it's about 50-50 physical to digital. And then in terms of the physical breakdown of CD to LP, you know, maybe like between 15 and 20% of the total sales is LP. So another 30% is CD. I mean, we still sell a lot of CDs, you know. And I like CDs as a format. I think they sound great. And, you know, I prefer vinyl as like a thing. But I, you know, a lot of people still buy CDs. So people have been writing off CDs for about 10 years now, and we're still selling a decent amount of them. You know.
So that you put in your computer to download.
Yeah. The disc, and then you just put it somewhere.
What percentage of your energy is going to the label versus the band?
I mean, it's mostly the label, except at certain times, because the band. Superchunk, you know, in 2001, we put out a record, and then after 2002, didn't really tour or do anything until 2010. I mean, I was making Portastatic records, some with my friends Jennifer and Ben here, but during that time, so I was doing music, but it was on a much smaller scale. But in 2010, Superchunk made a record called Majesty Shredding, and we did a little bit of touring, and we're been working on a record that's going to come out later this year. And so in those periods of activity, like certainly a lot of energy for me is going to Superchunk, but it's much more sporadic. And you know, so overall it's the label, I would say.
What is your process for creating the, for lack of a better word, album art? Are the bands bringing those ideas? Are you using the look art?
It happens all different ways, actually. I mean, usually the bands at least have an idea. Sometimes they actually have the image. Sometimes they have the whole thing laid out by a friend of theirs, and then you have to kind of go in and fix it and make it, you know, fit the specs that you need or whatever. It's a pretty wide range, but we have a designer named Maggie Faust, who's worked for Merge for a few years now, who's a great designer. And she works closely with the bands. For instance, the Mount Moriah record cover is a photo that I believe that she and the band found that together, like searching an online database of WPA images. And that was a house that was being burned to, I think, make way for a dam that was going in. And so it was a black and white image, though, and then Maggie, I believe, colored it to make it look how it looks now. And I think, you know, she probably put together several drafts, and then the band said, well, we like this one, or can you make the font more like this, or, you know, so it's a real collaborative process, you know. And then another example is the She and Him record, which you can only see part of there, but She and Him, they have a designer that they like to work with. So when they deliver that, it's basically all done, and then, you know, it's up to, I mean, Maggie will still maybe design the poster or add mats or things like that, you know.
The way music gets distributed, has it diluted the field and made it more difficult for the truly great and unique artists to be recognized? Has it made it easier?
You mean in terms of how people find stuff now?
Yeah, the volume and the MySpace changed, and then
Yeah.
suddenly everybody's got music distributed in front of everybody all the time.
Yeah, no,
streaming all the time.
that's a good question, and it can be a fairly like numbing process to just go, to go online and just kind of browse. It's hard because it used to be that if you wanted a record that you'd heard about, you often had to go to your local store and have them order it because it was an import, or go to New York and buy your records there. And so in some ways like that, now that you can get everything, you don't have to work that hard anymore, but at the same time, now the work is in what you're saying, like sifting through just like everything, because everything is everywhere. And it's been a traditional thing in recent years at conferences to have, so there's always a panel that's like, why do we need record labels? And so, one of my answers to that is, there's several answers, but one of my answers is because I feel like, if you are really a fan of music and you pay attention to that kind of thing, a record label is a filter of sorts that is like one step towards helping you sift through just everything that's out there. Like if I'm reading about a band, if I keep seeing a band's name over and over again, a lot of times that means that everyone's talking about them, but it also could mean that they're still not very good. But if I'm reading about a band and I see that like, Matador's working with them, well, that gives me like at least one more step towards like wanting to hear that band, because I figure, well, I trust those people. They put out these other 10 records that I like. I'll go listen to that. And so I feel like in some ways that's one of the things that labels are still really good for, is acting as a filter. Ed.
I've always kind of wondered if you're a musician with multiple bands and you're just not particularly working on anything, and a little line comes to you or a couple of chords come to you, do you know, does a little snippet tell you which band that's going to be, or do you have to kind of work with something for a while to say, I thought this was going to be for this band, but it's actually a Superchunk song?
For me, I think it's usually more about what I'm interested in doing at the time. In other words, for instance, like for the years that Superchunk wasn't active and no one wanted to tour and people weren't really interested in making records, obviously it was easy for me then to say like, well, fine, like I'm gonna make these records over here. Even if musically some of those records are not that different from a Superchunk record, if well, I'm gonna be making this record with my brother playing drums and Jennifer and Ben playing bass and guitar, like it gives you like a direction and kind of leads the songwriting down that path, right? And whereas like, after we did Majesty Shredding, and that, I feel like that record came out well and the shows were fun that we did, I was much more feeling like, well, let's just, let's do another Superchunk record. And so writing kind of with that in mind, there's probably things that have just started, like you're saying, as just like a snippet, whether it's just like a demo that's just a guitar part before I forget it, I want to record it or whatever, or just like writing down words. And then those things kind of just sit somewhere until they get put to use or never do. That happens occasionally, but it's more like writing with a purpose, I think. Mark.
What changed for Merge once the Arcade Fire kind of blew up?
Well,
Or are there any changes? Are there any expectations that are different?
Yeah, well, certainly the band has expectations, and we all do, that their next record will, build on what they've already done. But I've had a conversation with the band where, we were talking about, coming out of the Grammys, why didn't their record just suddenly, because it had been out for a while already by the time the Grammy thing happened, and they did have the #1 record the week it came out. But after the Grammys, while it was selling well still, it didn't all of a sudden go platinum or something, And I've had a conversation with the band where they kind of had this feeling of like, well, nothing changed, like we won the Grammy, nothing changed, and I feel like I don't think it's totally true that nothing changed, but change is very incremental even when something like that happens. People can see that something won an award and feel like, oh, I should check that out, But if you listen to what's on the radio, like on Top 40 radio, it doesn't sound like the Arcade Fire, you know? And so like there's still like a disconnect between total mainstream, like over the top, like I said, Taylor Swift kind of success and a band that sounds like the Arcade Fire, you know? And they don't want to sound like what's on the radio, they want to sound like themselves. So you do get to a point, I mean, it's not a bad problem to have, but you do get to a point, I think, where when a band that's like an alternative, for lack of a better word, band gets to a certain level of success, but they don't want to sound all of a sudden like the bands that are bigger than them. They still want to keep sounding like themselves, but you run into this line by which just because someone loves the Adele record or the Mumford & Sons record doesn't mean they're going to love the Arcade Fire record, you know? So I feel like certainly it raised their profile and sold more records for them, but there was no like monumental change that happened at that moment, you know? Sure.
It sounds like at the beginning of your kind of recruitment for your label, it was much more just kind of like face-to-face, you know, band-to-band. How has that changed, especially with there being so much more noise?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, you know, every day we used to get demo tapes in the mail, and piles of demo tapes and then CDs, demo CDs and stuff like that at the P.O. box, and now it's more like emails from band managers, you know, with like a link to a SoundCloud page. And I used to really hate that because I just don't like listening to music on my computer. It doesn't sound good, and it's kind of annoying if you're trying to do something else and there's this thing that's playing over here. And but now I'm kind of appreciative because I can, in 5 seconds, know whether I need to hear anything more about that band. You know what I mean? Like I just click on the SoundCloud thing, listen for a little bit, and be like, okay, well now I can just at least check that off my list of bands I don't need to hear again. So that is one way that we get a lot of information in about bands. But in terms of the bands that we actually end up working with, while that has occasionally happened, it's still, again, it's not that different, you know, because a lot of it is, even though we're not touring as much anymore, and we used to find out about a lot of bands by playing with them, touring with them, meeting them in other towns. A lot of times we'll get emails from bands on Merge saying like, oh, you should hear my friend's band. You should see this band that we played with the other night. They're great. You know, they gave us their demos. They're really good. So we hear from bands that are on Merge, and you know, we've been around long enough now that we have long relationships with people that we trust and that work with bands in various capacities, booking agents, managers, that will get in touch with us, and they know us well enough to not come to us with every band that they work with, but if there's someone that they feel particularly strong about that would be good for Merge, then they'll come to us with that. And so it happens all different ways, really.
One last question.
How do you think about your role in the local community? I mean, beyond the music world, what you contribute to the Triangle area, to North Carolina, or do you think about it? Do you owe the community anything?
I mean, I think we certainly think of ourselves as a North Carolina company, a North Carolina record label. I think that, I mean, it's interesting because one question that we used to get, which we don't get that much anymore, but we used to get was, why don't you guys move to New York? Or like, why didn't you move to New York? Or Los Angeles or whatever, you know, like that's where the music industry is. And other than not wanting to just be part of that part of the music industry, I mean, I think that we always felt like, how does anyone pay their rent in New York? How does like a record label survive in New York, you know? Whereas like we were, again, our office was usually like in a rented house or something where our overhead was low and people want to be living here and it's not incredibly expensive to live here, so people's salaries don't have to be as high, you know, to be able to do what they want to do. So it always made sense for us to be here. And we certainly like it when there are a lot of active bands on Merge that are from North Carolina, even though that hasn't always been the case. One thing that I think that has bothered some people is that we've never seen it as our mission to like be a label that has, you know, that works with North Carolina artists exclusively or even mainly. Because our thing has always just been putting out records by bands that we love, and they're not all from North Carolina. But I feel like, I mean, I was kind of bummed when we had to move from Chapel Hill to Durham because we had always been in Carrboro or Chapel Hill. But it is great being in Durham, and I grew up in Durham. And downtown Durham now is really different than, it's different than when I grew up there, and it's also different than when we moved there, and that was only 11 years ago. So it's cool to be in a place that's changing, and as far as, I don't know if I've answered your question, but certainly like we are engaged with, we're in Durham, we want Durham to be a better place all around us, right? So, we try to be involved in the community as much as we can be.
Well, thanks so much, Matt.
Sure, thank you, thanks.